Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Day by Day Performance Podcast. Today is going to be a solo episode, and today we're going to be talking all about emotions, and specifically a framework in which we can view emotions, use emotions, and respond to different situations that gives us a healthier advantage to dealing with life circumstances. Emotions can be a really tricky area to navigate, especially because, well, we all have them, and some of them come in different flavors, shapes, and sizes. Some of them are happy, some of them are sad, some are really, really hard to sit with. Others make us feel very good. Whatever the emotion is, they have different weights, they have different value, and there are different ways that we want to use them in our lives. Where this becomes an issue is when we have trouble regulating our emotions, we have trouble expressing them, and really being able to use them in a functional manner. So, what I want to share with you today is something called the ruler approach. Yes, ruler, like the thing we'd measure a foot with in school. The ruler approach is something that's been established by Marc Brackett and the Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence. And with this ruler approach, there's 5 tenets to the concept. There's that you can recognize, understand, label, express, and regulate your emotions. Ruler, it's an acronym. As we know, it's like we all love acronyms. But with the ruler approach, what we learn is pretty much from start to finish how to emotion. I want to share a disclaimer that the contents of this podcast are intended for educational and informational purposes only. The thoughts and opinions expressed are solely my own and do not represent the official positions of my employer, my university, or any related organizations. Nothing shared in this podcast should be considered mental health treatment, clinical advice, or medical guidance. While we discuss topics related to performance, well-being, and psychology, the information is not a substitute for working with a qualified professional. Listeners should consult the appropriate licensed providers for individualized support. Thank you. And a lot of what Marc Brackett talks about in his book, Permission to Feel, and with the Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence, they talk about how there's a lack of an emotional education that limits us and has kind of gotten us in this space where emotions are really hard to deal with. And understandably so. I remember when I was growing up and in school, it wasn't like we were always talking about emotions and how to process them. And so when I started dealing with my own emotions when they'd come up, I wasn't necessarily prepared for what I was experiencing or knowing what I was going through. There are a lot of individuals who will say, "Oh, I never knew I was struggling with anxiety until, boom, some moment," right? There's going to be some specific trigger or cue that brings on this sudden awareness that they'd never had before. And that can be really problematic when we aren't feeling equipped to handle life's challenges. If you've listened to a previous episode about acceptance and commitment therapy, you'll know I've talked about different things with life and how suffering, hardship, and pain are fundamental pieces that go along with life. So, thinking about pain and how there's emotional pain, these are things that are natural in life to occur. But it's what we do, how willing we are to experience it, and how we regulate and respond. That's what makes the difference in whether we're choosing to sit in pain versus suffering, where we can't really control that pain exists, but we can control how much we suffer based on how much we contribute to it by resisting, by pushing back, by saying, "No, I don't want to feel this." I'm guilty of it just like everybody else. We push away things we don't want to feel, and that resistance leads us to suffer more. What Brackett and his colleagues at Yale essentially say is that we're going to have something from the start of emotional experiences through the end and how we can navigate it effectively. So, I want to run through some examples of how these would be put into action step by step through the acronym. This can be really helpful for coaches, parents, or athletes themselves wanting to learn more about emotional expression, regulating your feelings, and simply being aware of what's going on. We all have emotions. We all have feelings about said emotions. However, it's what we do with them to use them in productive manners that makes the difference. I want to start talking about how Brackett describes there's 2 camps we can really sit in when it comes to emotions and how we view them. We can either be an emotional scientist or an emotional judge. And if you can kind of chalk it up based off those words, a scientist is going to be somebody who's investigating, who's researching, who's curiously observing what we have in front of us and making decisions from there based on the information and data collected. Whereas a judge will be making decisions based upon these, in this case, emotions, or having different value placements put on to the emotions we're experiencing. For example, if I'm feeling frustrated because of a certain event that happened in my sport, the value I'm attributing to that would be more related to being an emotion judge than being an emotion scientist and observing and saying, I'm curious as to what this emotion is trying to tell me. There's a concept mentioned in books like Ethan Kross's Chatter and Shift that emotions are to be used as signals, as pure information, rather than fact or law. When we're experiencing emotions, we can just observe them and say, oh, I am aware that is an experience that I'm currently feeling. Or I can see that this is something going on, rather than saying that this emotion wholly captures my identity, my experience in this moment. We're looking to use emotions as signals to give us information on what to do next. It goes back to our primal instincts in wanting to make sure that we can survive. Emotions are there to protect us. Where it gets in the way a lot of times that people find, especially dealing with something like anxiety or feelings of fear, is that when we're in situations that aren't actually warranting such anxiety or fear, we are experiencing it nonetheless. And this can be challenging because it's meant to protect us. And the signal is saying, hey, this is potentially dangerous. Watch out, body. It's trying to look out for you, but it doesn't always fit. So the first element of this ruler technique is recognizing emotions. With recognizing emotions, it's important to understand where emotions can sit. You'll see we have 4 different quadrants represented here. We have a red quadrant, a yellow quadrant, a blue quadrant, and a green quadrant. These areas are places that different emotions can sit, where we're looking on this axis, the y-axis here, of pleasantness. How pleasant is it to feel this emotion? What does it feel like? Does it give us the warm and fuzzies? Is it cold and off-putting? Whereas energy is this x-axis. So on the scale, we're kind of measuring, is it a low energy emotion? Is it something that is more slow-paced, more calm? Or is it something that's higher intensity in this energy? Whether you're being at a concert or you're in a heated argument, these intense, more energized emotions, that's where we want to figure out where on this wheel or this chart does it sit. When we're able to identify and recognize the kind of emotion we're experiencing, is this a red emotion? Is this a blue emotion? These are things that can help us better assess our situation and figure out what we need to do next to care for ourselves or take that next step forward. So that's what we call the mood meter. Being able to place your emotions on this scale and having the colors helps to give it some life and energy. It simplifies it so someone like a child could understand where am I putting things, and helps us as adults better figure out where things land, right? Being able to associate something with a color rather than a specific word is typically an easier start to being able to label our emotions and help process them. One thing with recognizing emotions that I think is particularly powerful is related to a quote that Alexander Pope, a poet, once said, that all looks yellow to the jaundiced eye. And what this saying is that when you're looking at the world through, say, a rose-tinted lens, if we've heard of that expression before, everything looks red. Well, if we're looking through the world through a jaundiced eye, being yellow, we would see that everything is yellow. And so if we're thinking about our mood meter, or maybe even the feelings wheel that I had next to me, if we're looking at the world through a colored lens, we're going to see things like that. If I'm going through the world with a positive outlook, I'm more likely to see things that are positive, or I'm experiencing as positive. This can be really helpful to understand and learn about yourself when you're analyzing your own emotions and saying, how is my worldview contributing to my feelings? We know that people who typically struggle with depression more than others are often having a negative worldview, and that can be a risk factor. These are things we want to tend to and make sure that we're aware of, because once we're aware of it, we can figure out what that next best step is, like I've mentioned. Sometimes it's to keep stepping in the right direction, but other times, if we're looking through the world through a negative outlook and we really want a positive one, that's when we want to be able to make that shift. But the first step is being aware of it and recognizing the emotion. The next part of the ruler acronym that I want to highlight is U for understanding. When we can understand our emotions, that's when we're going to be able to better label, express, and regulate them. It's a step along the way. The concept of understanding emotions can seem pretty elementary. However, it's important to realize that emotions are so nuanced and are so specific that sometimes we can be mislabeling things, misidentifying the emotional experience we're having, and that can contribute to some of our struggle. For example, stress and pressure are two different emotions. Stress is where the system is under so much strain that it doesn't have the capacity or the resources to kind of negate it or cancel out the demand. Think about supply and demand. Stress is when there is more demand than there is supply. When you're not able to meet those needs and that threshold to continue coasting, that's when stress really comes into the picture. Pressure is when you're perceiving a situation to have some sort of weight and an outcome that you can prepare for. This may be different than stress because pressure, you might have the tools to meet that demand, to meet that challenge. Whereas stress, you're not able to keep up with what demand is at hand. But oftentimes, we'll use those words interchangeably. Stress, pressure, what's the difference? But there is a difference. It's in how we're communicating it that influences essentially what others are picking up, how they can care for us too. If I am going to tell you, hey, I'm under a lot of stress right now. If I'm using the definition of stress, that means I have a lot of pressure on me. That's different than if I were to truly be experiencing stress. This isn't to invalidate the experience of somebody who's experiencing something like that, but using specific words and languages changes how it might be viewed by our peers, or how we view our peers' needs as well. Because if somebody were to tell me that they're stressed or under pressure, I might have different responses for how I engage in supporting them. Or if I'm asking for that help, maybe if I'm not using the right words, I'm not going to get the help and support I need in that moment. Communicating specifically and accurately makes a big difference with understanding emotions. I think a common example of this is when people say, oh my God, I had a panic attack last week, when in reality, they got overwhelmed with a situation that might have been pretty stressful. But to define it as a panic attack is a very commonplace thing for us to say, where in reality, that's a clinical experience in which somebody's experiencing specific symptomology that wouldn't equate to, oh, I had a panic attack last week because I was late turning my homework. We want to specify what that experience is so that we're not mislabeling it. Now, society will mislabel things. That happens. But when we're trying to understand our emotions and really label it accurately, it's important that we are using the correct terms, especially with ourselves, but also with learning with others, so that we can better view the world through the correct colored lenses. So say we're viewing a situation and in the English language, we might be using words that would put us more in this red emotional space, like we were showing on the mood meter. That will be different than if the emotions truly are sitting closer to a yellow or maybe even a green or a blue situation. Those experiences can be influenced by the words that we're using to describe them. Because if I am diagnosing something as an emotional experience that feels yellow or feels blue, I'm going to respond differently than if that emotion were to actually be diagnosed as red. When I'm saying diagnosed, I mean just identified, not in any clinical diagnostic sense. The mood meter is supposed to be a helpful resource, not a measure of clinical experience. Similarly, building off of understanding our emotions is labeling them. I've been mentioning it quite a bit throughout, but labeling emotions is something where we're able to attach correct and proper identification for the emotion we're experiencing, because then we can better respond. The Sapir-Whorf hypothesis is something I've learned about recently while reading Marc Brackett's book, Permission to Feel. In this hypothesis, we're essentially saying the languages we're learning or the languages we know set some parameters for how we learn and experience emotions. Because in many languages, there are words that the English language does not have. For example, there's a word in Japanese called kaizen, which is to mean change for the better. While there isn't a specific word for this in English, that is a word in another language that might broaden someone else's horizon if they speak that. So viewing English as your language for emotions can be limiting, just as viewing another language solely can be limiting. So therefore, the experiences we have are made up of our languages that we've learned, the language we speak, and the experiences that surround that. can sound a little confusing, but the point being is that having the right words, terminology, and language for our emotions can make a big difference. Because what I may not be able to express and verbalize might still be a very real experience just because the language I speak doesn't have the word for it. The next element of the ruler approach is E. It's for expressing emotion. Expressing emotion can be one of the hardest things for people to do. And this is in part because the different cultural, societal standards and norms that are in place influence how we interact on the day-to-day basis. Sometimes men feel like they aren't able to speak up and cry about their emotions. But also, men are offered the privileges many times of being able to express anger and frustration in such powerful ways, whereas women may not be able to. We see this a lot of times in professional sports. If you think about tennis, people who smash their racket, Serena Williams may get penalized for it, whereas men may be able to be rewarded, be told, oh, these guys are showing so much emotion, so much bravery and passion. There's double standards in society in how we view emotions, and so that can make expressing it all the more difficult. But by being able to recognize, understand, and label emotions, we are one step closer to being able to express them. And that's engaging with the feeling, sitting with it, allowing it to be there, and then we start to progress into that next section. So maybe acknowledging this emotion, if it's sadness, if it's even joy, the ability to express, whether it's through tears, hugs, laughter, this is going to be something that we need to learn how to do in order to regulate our emotions, which is the next piece. We can't regulate until we've recognized, understood, labeled, and expressed our emotions. So, what is regulating our emotions? The R in regulating for emotions relates a lot to the podcast I had about ACT, which I've referenced earlier in this episode already. But if we're able to regulate our emotions, that means we're able to hold it in the space. We're expressing it. We're not suppressing the emotion, pushing it under a rug that we won't be able to see. But instead, we're choosing what to do within that moment, how to process it, and move forward. I say this relates a lot to ACT because we can look at our values and how that drives our work. When we're thinking about values-based work and then choosing those committed actions to go with it, if I have certain values, I want to act in line with that. Regulating my emotions will follow a similar tune. If I am expressing an emotion such as anger in a way that is in line with my values, that's going to be more beneficial, more in line with my worldview and how I interact with others. But also, if it is not in line with my values, if it is not in line with the action that I am hoping to engage with, that gets pretty challenging. Because then we want to be able to modify or accept the situation we're in, change how we're engaging with the emotion so that we can better be present, better move forward. Whatever it is that is in line with our values and that committed action, regulating our emotions helps us get there. There are lots of very popular ways to regulate emotions. Some are more effective than others. Throwing clipboards technically is regulating your emotions. But if you're a coach, that may not be the most appropriate use of the emotions and the regulation skills. So what are better ways to regulate? Some people engage in mindfulness. Some people meditate. Some go and just go for a walk. They say, I need 5 minutes. They take some deep breaths. People will go for exercise, so they'll go for a run. They'll lift some weights. Some people go to those rage rooms where they bring all this stuff that they can break to get their feelings out, get that energy out. Regulating your emotions looks different for everybody, but what's important is that we do it in a way that is beneficial and productive for our space. So making my driveway's basketball hoop a new rage room item is probably not the best way I want to regulate my emotions when I'm really struggling while shooting hoops outside. The better way to do this for me might be, okay, we're going to put the ball down. We're going to take 5 minutes. We're going to get some water. We're going to distract for a minute. And that's fine because we'll come back, we'll pick up the ball again, and we'll address the situation at hand, whether it's I'm playing pickup with a friend and I'm losing, or I'm trying to meet a certain goal that I'm practicing for and I'm falling short. The important thing is we're not avoiding to the point where we dismiss it completely and we're suppressing the emotion, but instead we're choosing how to manage in those moments and step forward. Again, there's so many ways in which you can regulate emotions. Some are healthier than others. And there's not a cut and dry answer as for what is useful when. It's going to be different for everybody, and it's important to recognize and give ourselves some grace with that. But if we can move towards this lens of acceptance and defusing from some thoughts we're having. So say I'm feeling angry because of a certain experience, by being able to remove myself from the feeling or unstick us. So the feeling is here, I'm here, there's a distance between it. That can be helpful in just saying, I'm going to notice that I'm angry. I'm going to be present with the feeling. And I'm going to choose to regulate by taking some deep breaths, going to get some water, what have you. Maybe it's centering back within my team, changing my focus from this internal approach to a more external approach. If I'm so fed up and frustrated with myself, maybe it's finding a teammate, giving them a high five. Maybe it's finding something to pay attention to that isn't within me. We talk about extending our focus from internal to external. Take those blinders off. Take off the glasses and look at the world through maybe a wider lens. There's so many ways in which you can regulate emotions, and the ruler process does a really good job in highlighting those different ways. If you are looking for like your company or something to regulate emotions better, they have a lot of programming for it. And I think that's really cool because being able to establish an emotional education, especially at a young age, equips people with the tools to handle their emotions better. When we aren't able to handle our emotions, you notice people have, crash outs on field. We aren't able to properly express them or regulate in ways that are appropriate for the setting we're in. And that is where we run into issues. That's where we run into character disputes. Oh, this athlete is X, Y, and Z because they can't handle their emotions. If somebody had taught us growing up in a very developed way how to handle these in society where it is acceptable to have certain experiences, we learn how to cope with different feelings, we might have different outcomes. And that's a lot of what Brackett talks about and what I would encourage everyone to go learn more about through the Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence. We know that intelligence is this construct that's heavily researched and measured through IQ tests and different assessments of the sort, but this is looking more at our emotional intelligence, something that may be a little harder to assess and directly measure, but it's something that matters nonetheless. There's been a lot of progress with the research in this area over the past 30 years, but this is something that'll be ever growing. And this is something that for individuals throughout life, we're all ever growing in our emotional intelligence and experience. Every single day, we're going to have to engage with recognizing, understanding, labeling, expressing, and regulating our emotions. It's a matter of how intentional we are with it and how effective we are with it. As always, if you're struggling with your experience with emotions, it's important you ask for help. While this podcast is not a substitute for medical advice, like I've mentioned on every episode, it is still something where you deserve to have support and help when you're going through hard times, whether that be talking to a friend, a family member, a coworker, a loved one, or even talking to a counselor or professional. These are things that you want to be able to engage in so that you can take care of yourself best. So if you're having any issues with that, please be sure to reach out to somebody, get that support, because navigating emotions is hard. Not something that's going to change overnight. It often takes lots of practice to be able to undo habits that we've built throughout our lives and learn something new. People talk all the time about how, learning a second language, do it when you're young. It's easier to learn when you're young. If you look at the world and emotions through a similar lens, it's likely very much easier to learn things when you're young and your brain's more neuroplastic and you're still developing, you're growing. This is something that can be really helpful for your kids or yourself if you are listening to this and you're young. This is something that is important that we establish in education, in the systems we live in, and make that change so that society as a whole is better at expressing their emotions. People are able to function more healthfully. These are all steps in a very long process, but it's something that's a start. So we can do it by looking at things through a ruler focus. We are recognizing, understanding, labeling, expressing, and regulating our emotions. That's going to do it for today's episode, but if you have any questions, feel free to let me know. I'm going to leave information in the description for today's episode, especially related to the ruler approach, the Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence, and the book Permission to Feel. Until the next time, you've been listening to the Day by Day Performance Podcast. Hey, it's Patrick. Thanks for listening to the Day by Day Performance Podcast. If you're interested in learning more, go ahead and click the description on whatever you're listening to. You can find all the bios, links, and references from today's episode. Until the next time, hope you enjoyed the episode and keep taking things day by day.